The winter of 1944 came down like a curse. The trees of the Ardennes stood stripped and skeletal, their blackened branches slicing into a sky the color of lead. Snow fell sideways, whipped by a wind that carried the faint, metallic smell of war. Beneath a sagging camouflage net, buried half in frost and half in silence, an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer waited, its steel skin so cold it could almost crack. Inside, Private First Class Ray Thompson peered through a fogged periscope, breath shallow, heartbeat steady, the world reduced to a narrow slit of glass and light. His gloved hands trembled, not from fear, but from the chill that seemed to seep through the armor itself, cold that felt ancient, patient, and merciless. Out there, beyond the ridge, he could see them, a column of German armor crawling through the forest like a living machine. 12 tanks, maybe more. Most were Panzer V's, their angular silhouettes moving with practiced precision. But at the head of the column rolled something heavier, possibly a Tiger I, its turret scanning like the eye of some mechanical predator. Behind them came half-tracks packed with infantry, and farther still, the silhouettes of fuel and ammunition trucks, their barrels gleaming faintly beneath the snow. They were moving toward a crossroads that, if captured, would sever the lifeline to the 101st Airborne Division entrenched in Bastogne, men who were already surrounded, already fighting for their lives. Thompson knew that if the German armor reached that road, Bastogne would fall, and yet he had no orders. His radio remained silent, command distant and unreachable. He had been told, observe only, do not engage. But as the enemy rolled closer, the line between waiting and watching men die blurred until it disappeared. And so, without command, without permission, Ray Thompson pulled the trigger. In that single instant, everything, the battle, the rules, even the rhythm of war itself, shifted. 3 days earlier, in a drafty Belgian farmhouse near Neuville, Thompson and the men of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion had gathered around a wooden table. The smell of damp wool and diesel hung thick in the air. Their commanding officer, a tall man with eyes as cold as the fields outside, spoke with deliberate calm. "No one fires without confirmation from command," he said. "I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they are. We will not reveal our position without orders." No one argued. They just nodded, the sound of pencils scratching across field notebooks filling the silence. But beneath that obedience simmered unease. Everyone knew something was coming. Outside, Operation Wacht am Rhein had begun, Hitler's final gamble in the West. Under cover of fog, the Wehrmacht had unleashed more than 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks across the frozen front, slicing into Allied lines with shocking speed. For the Americans, confusion reigned. Maps were useless by morning. Entire platoons vanished overnight. Some positions changed hands twice in the same day. And amid the chaos, commanders feared the worst mistake of all, friendly fire. That fear hardened into doctrine, wait for orders. For Thompson and his three-man crew, that meant observation duty. Their Wolverine sat dug into a shallow ridge north of Neuville, its 3-inch gun aimed toward a forest road below. They had cover, range, and a perfect field of fire. What they didn't have was permission to use it. Day and night, Thompson watched the valley through his frost-clouded scope. He noted the tread marks in the snow, the rhythm of supply convoys, the way German engines idled longer before dawn. He wrote it all in a small spiral notebook his mother had mailed from Kansas, its pages now warped by oil stains and frost. Range, 800 yards. Bearing, east by northeast. Wind, 9 knots, cross. Once, he'd tracked a lone Panzer for nearly an hour as it crept along the ravine. His finger hovered over the trigger, but the radio stayed silent. No orders came. The tank passed, leaving behind only exhaust and frustration. The discipline held, but barely, because discipline, he knew, could be both shield and shackle. One wrong shell could expose their position, bring artillery screaming down. But one right shot taken too late could mean the death of hundreds. The longer he waited, the more he began to wonder, was doing nothing truly the safer choice? Raymond Charles Thompson had never thought of himself as a warrior. He was born under wide Kansas skies, where the horizon stretched farther than ambition itself. His father, Charles, fixed tractors and harvesters in a shed that smelled of oil and iron. His mother, Anna, taught math at the local school, and from her, Ray inherited a love of precision, the quiet joy of a perfect angle, the satisfaction of symmetry. As a boy, he'd measured the distance between fence posts, or time how long it took for the windmill's shadow to cross the barn. When other kids played baseball, he was busy rigging pulley systems and counterweights, testing how far a stone could fly if launched at just the right arc. That curiosity followed him into the Army. He enlisted in 1942, not out of hunger for glory, but because it offered him a path to study engineering, a chance to learn how things worked, even in chaos. But Europe changed that. By the time he rolled off the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, Thompson had seen enough to grow old before his years. The hedgerows were nightmares of mud and ambush. Enemies so close you could hear their breathing before the shots. He lost friends there. Jimmy Delgado, burned alive in a half-track. Frank Murray, erased by a mine outside St. Lo. After that, Ray stopped believing in luck, or in orders that didn't fit the ground truth. He started believing in patterns. He learned how long it took a German turret to rotate, how their tank crews used radio silence before a flanking maneuver, how the same officer who led the charge one morning would hesitate the next. He turned those observations into sketches, formulas, probabilities. Soon his squad called him the Quiet Clock, a man who measured war, not in courage or fear, but in seconds and degrees. By December, he'd survived 6 months that had killed men twice as strong. The Army saw him as a disciplined gunner, steady, reliable, calm under fire. But what they didn't see, not yet, was the quiet defiance building inside him, a realization that sometimes the battlefield moved faster than any order could travel. That morning of December 19, 1944, dawn never really came. The fog lay thick over the Ardennes, clinging to the pines like breath on glass. Sound traveled strangely, muffled, distorted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Through the periscope, Thompson saw the first shadow, the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger tank, then another, then the long, disciplined column of armor that followed, the Wehrmacht machine grinding forward through the snow. 12 vehicles, maybe more, tanks, half-tracks, fuel trucks, and infantry. The column moved with precision born of long habit, confident, unhurried. To the Germans, this forest road was just another artery on the way to Bastogne. To Thompson, it was a death trap waiting to be sprung. The path was narrow, hemmed in by steep embankments and trees thick as walls. No room to maneuver, no room to scatter. He marked distances with the calm of a man solving a problem, not fighting a war. 800 yards, range steady, wind left to right, elevation 5 degrees. He exhaled slowly, the frost from his breath curling in front of his face. He had no orders, but he had eyes. And in that frozen silence, as the Tiger rolled into his crosshairs, Ray Thompson realized something that all soldiers come to face at least once. Sometimes, the only order that matters is the one your conscience gives you. He reached for the trigger, and somewhere in the forest, history held its breath. The radio was a ghost, its voice fading in and out beneath the static of the Ardennes wind. Command was somewhere far beyond the snow and chaos, unreachable. Every message came fractured, half words and broken syllables, swallowed by the storm. Hold. Position. Report only. That was all Thompson heard before the frequency died into silence. To follow the book, he was supposed to stay hidden, observe, record, and wait for artillery or air support to handle the rest. But what filled his scope wasn't just movement. It was intent. The German column before him wasn't retreating. It was advancing like a blade drawn for the throat of the American line. That narrow, frozen road below, barely wide enough for two vehicles abreast, wasn't just another forest path. It was the artery leading straight to Nouville, and from there, the northern flank of Bastogne. If the enemy reached that crossroads, they would cut off the 101st Airborne Division, sealing its fate. Bastogne would fall. Reinforcements would never arrive. And in the snowbound silence of the Ardennes, tens of thousands of Americans would be trapped, isolated and devoured by the weight of steel and cold. Still, the tanks rolled forward, their engines a low mechanical heartbeat under the trees. The Germans were confident. They believed the Americans were scattered, disorganized, too frightened to strike back. In part, they were right. Ray Thompson was scared, terrified even. He was cold to the bone, his breath coming in shallow bursts that crystallized in the air. His hands were stiff inside his gloves. He was alone. But he was not disorganized. Behind that trembling calm lay the calculating rhythm of a man who saw war as geometry, a deadly equation of distance, trajectory, and timing. He knew the risks. Fire too early, and the enemy would scatter into the trees. Miss, and they would trace his position, and rain fire until nothing remained of him or his crew. But strike with precision, in the right order, at the right moment, and a single gun could do what entire batteries could not. It wasn't bravery that steadied him. It was arithmetic, a grim, practiced certainty that, in the right hands, mathematics could become a weapon sharper than instinct. He adjusted the elevation wheel, exhaled slowly, and watched the enemy advance through his sights. This wasn't a scene for textbooks. No commander had written a manual for moments like this. Somewhere inside that Wolverine, a quiet line was crossed between soldier and survivor, between obedience and choice. Ray Thompson had never once fired without orders. Not in training, not in France, not even when his instincts had begged him to days earlier, when a lone Panzer passed within range. But now, with 12 German vehicles crawling through his crosshairs, the truth came clear. Waiting wasn't caution anymore. Waiting was suicide. He tightened his grip on the firing handle, whispered to himself, and pulled the trigger. The Wolverine roared. The sound shattered the forest silence, kicking up a wave of snow and smoke. The armor-piercing round tore through the fog, a streak of light in the white-gray haze, and slammed into the third tank of the German column. Not the lead. He'd avoided that deliberately, but the third. The shell struck the Panzer IV's flank where the armor was thin. A heartbeat later, the world flashed orange. The explosion lifted the vehicle sideways, its treads spinning uselessly as it collapsed into the ditch. The shockwave echoed through the woods. Birds burst from the branches. Every tank in the column halted, brakes grinding, crews shouting in confusion. Inside the Wolverine, the loader was already at work, muscles moving from memory. Thompson's hand found the traverse crank. He shifted position, crawling the M10 5 yards to the left, just enough to throw off any enemy gunners searching for muzzle flash. Then, he fired again. This time, the shell hit the 6th vehicle, a half-track filled with infantry. The explosion rolled like thunder through the forest. Fuel ignited. Flames climbed into the branches, licking the snow as black smoke spiraled upward. The forest floor flickered in orange patches, firelight dancing on the frost. Thompson didn't stop. He called for another round, his voice steady. He aimed for the 8th vehicle, a fuel truck. The result was instantaneous. a blast that tore the valley open, a roar so deep it rattled the Wolverine's hull. Fire surged into the sky like a volcanic plume. The pressure wave knocked snow from the trees. For a moment, it looked like the heavens themselves had split. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Their formation, tight, efficient, disciplined, was collapsing in on itself. The Tiger at the head tried to reverse, but the path behind was blocked by wreckage. The narrow road that had once given them protection now became their prison. Crews shouted orders over the noise. Panzer commanders climbed from their turrets, scanning the tree line for enemy guns that didn't exist. Through the Tiger's periscope, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Krüger saw only smoke. The snow was blackened now, the air choked with soot. Somewhere in the mist, something unseen had struck them. His radio crackled with panic. Reports of multiple American batteries, unseen numbers. "A full ambush," someone cried. "There must be 10 of them." Krüger gritted his teeth. There were no tracers, no visible muzzle flash, just invisible precision, methodical, relentless. He thought briefly of how the Americans were supposed to be in retreat. He was wrong. Back inside the Wolverine, Thompson worked with surgical calm. Every shot followed logic. The first had blocked the road. The second had severed the middle. The third had ignited the rear. Fuel, munitions, chaos. A perfect chain reaction, each explosion feeding the next. His shots weren't wild bursts of rage. They were the strokes of an engineer dismantling a machine. The forest screamed now. The sharp cracks of tank guns mixed with the deeper growl of secondary explosions. Trees split and fell. The snow caught fire where oil had spilled. The air smelled of iron and burning pine. In that infernal mix of heat and frost, the German formation disintegrated. The Tiger's crew tried to pivot, its heavy turret grinding slowly toward the ridge. Thompson didn't move. He waited. He knew its armor. Thickest in front, vulnerable at the flanks. When it turned broadside, he took aim. A slow inhale, a measured exhale. He fired. The shell hit just beneath the turret ring. A burst of sparks, then a plume of smoke. The Tiger's gun sagged, then froze. The giant was paralyzed, trapped in its own fortress of steel. Inside the Wolverine, sweat poured down faces that hadn't smiled in days. The loader's hands were raw, bleeding under the gloves. The assistant gunner's throat was hoarse from shouting coordinates. The smell of hot oil and gunpowder filled the cabin. But Thompson's focus was absolute. He spoke little, his eyes locked on the sights, his breathing steady, as if he were back home lining up the edges of a blueprint. He shifted position again, 10 yards, then 15. Each move a whisper in the snow. Every relocation brought confusion. Every shot fed illusion. The Germans thought they were facing an entire American ambush. Some claimed there were 4 Wolverines in the hills. Others swore it was an artillery battery. They fired blindly into the forest, shredding trees and snowbanks, but hitting nothing. By the half-hour mark, the once orderly column was a graveyard of twisted steel. 5 tanks destroyed, 3 crippled beyond movement. The remaining vehicles, fuel and supply trucks, were abandoned. Their drivers fled into the trees, their boots leaving frantic trails in the snow. The forest dimmed with smoke. Flames hissed against the ice. Thompson lowered the periscope for a moment, his chest heaving, his pulse steadying. The gun barrel glowed, faintly red from heat. Around him, his crew exchanged glances, disbelief, exhaustion, awe. He said nothing. He simply looked back through the sight at the Tiger, still motionless amid the ruin. And as he did, the snow began to fall again, softly, silently, covering the wreckage, muffling the echoes, as if the forest itself was trying to bury what had just happened. Only the faint hiss of cooling metal remained, like a whispered confession fading into the cold. If you knew tanks, truly knew them, you could sense the rhythm of their movement, the way a hunter senses breath before a strike. Every turn, Every gear shift, every pause had meaning. And if you understood that rhythm, if you waited until the exact second the steel hull exposed just a fraction of its flank, then that was your window. Ray Thompson knew it. He felt it. The fifth shell left the barrel with a deep, metallic roar that rolled across the trees. A flash, white, then orange, and the round found its mark. For a brief, hanging moment, the Tiger's armor held. Then its belly erupted with a sound that was less an explosion and more the tearing of the world itself. The internal ammunition ignited. The turret tore loose, hurled skyward in a cloud of smoke and heat before crashing back to Earth, a twisted crown in a burning forest. The shockwave rippled down the line. The German anti-aircraft gun positioned at the rear shuddered violently, its gunners dropping their weapons, their faces pale in the reflected firelight. They bolted into the trees, silhouettes swallowed by smoke. The once pristine column, a mechanical symphony of German order, was now a graveyard of fire. Smoke drifted low, curling around the wrecks like fog over a graveyard. The morning light, pale and cold, filtered through the haze, catching on twisted steel and glowing embers. The road that had promised a clear advance toward Bastogne was gone, replaced by a choking corridor of flame and ruin. Inside the Wolverine, the crew sat in silence. One of the men turned toward Thompson, his voice half awe, half disbelief. "So, are we still going to get court-martialed for this?" Thompson didn't answer. He reloaded quietly, the click of metal the only reply. The battle wasn't over. Hours later, in a makeshift American field tent, a captured German lieutenant sat shivering beneath a rough wool blanket. His once gray uniform was blackened with soot. One sleeve had been burned away completely. He spoke haltingly in broken English, still stunned by what he'd seen. "There were many guns," he said, his voice shaking. "At least 6, maybe 8. A full battery." The American intelligence officers exchanged glances. They knew the truth. There had been no battery, no coordinated ambush, not even a second vehicle. Just one M10 Wolverine. One gunner. Other German prisoners told different stories. Some swore they'd been ambushed by paratroopers armed with anti-tank weapons. Others insisted the Americans had mined the road, that the explosions were the result of hidden charges. One young soldier, barely 20, claimed to have seen muzzle flashes from 3 different directions. But there were no mines, no paratroopers, no crossfire. Thompson had moved his vehicle after every shot, shifting positions so methodically that even the most experienced German crews had been convinced they were under attack from multiple angles. In their confusion, they began to invent enemies that didn't exist. In the chaos of battle, the mind fills the gaps it can't explain. Fear sketches phantoms in the smoke. Some tank commanders claimed they'd seen American armor lurking deeper in the trees, others that they'd heard whistles, ghostly signals between hidden units. It wasn't cowardice, it was human nature, men trying to find reason in what felt impossible. And in a way, they weren't wrong. What Ray Thompson had done was impossible. No doctrine in the Wehrmacht's playbook accounted for an American tank destroyer acting alone, striking with surgical precision and vanishing like mist. German military intelligence had long believed the U.S. Army to be rigid, effective only when operating under direct command, slow to improvise, predictable. But on that frozen road outside Novel, one Kansas farm boy had defied the stereotype. He had thought like a German officer, moved like a hunter, and struck like a ghost. When the Americans finally advanced through the woods later that day, what they found didn't look like the aftermath of a skirmish. It looked like the aftermath of an airstrike. Vehicles lay piled like toppled dominoes, their armor blackened and fused together by heat. Tank tracks were twisted sideways, some half buried in the snow. Trees had been split in two, their trunks splayed open like shattered bone. The silence was heavy, almost reverent. There were no American bodies, none at all, because there had only ever been one gunner. The Germans who survived gave the incident a name that would echo through their ranks for months afterward: Die Geister Battery, the Ghost Battery. A phantom artillery line that had appeared out of nowhere, struck with unearthly precision, and vanished before anyone could fire back. For Thompson, however, victory came with silence. In the hours that followed, after the last echoes of battle faded into the frozen woods, he sat inside the Wolverine, staring through the periscope at the rising smoke. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced by a cold weight that pressed against his chest. He'd disobeyed a direct order. He knew it. So did his crew. And though they were alive, against all odds, they were waiting for the punishment that had to come. When they finally returned to headquarters, Thompson filed his report. It was meticulous. Range estimates, wind calculations, strike patterns, even sketches of each vehicle's placement. His commanding officer, Captain Langston, read it slowly, his face unreadable. He turned a page, then another, before finally setting it down. "You know," he said quietly, "if this had gone wrong, if even one of those shots had hit our own men." Thompson nodded before he could finish. "I know, sir." Langston leaned back, exhaled, rubbed a hand over his eyes. "No one authorized this, Thompson. You understand that?" "I do, sir." The captain didn't shout, didn't even raise his voice. After a moment, he simply said, "Get some rest. I'll have to send this up the chain." Upstairs meant division command, which meant scrutiny, paperwork, and, most likely, punishment. Thompson returned to his crew. They said little, no pats on the back, no nervous laughter, just the quiet hum of an idling engine and the slow realization that, for the first time in days, no one was shooting at them. But before the reprimand could come, something else arrived. Men from the 101st Airborne. They reached the sector 2 days later, frost clinging to their uniforms, eyes hollow from exhaustion. They'd fought their way out of Bastogne, expecting to face German armor on every road. Instead, they found a forest of wreckage, charred hulls, frozen treads, silence. They asked who had done it, what unit had held the line. Langston's answer was simple. "It wasn't a unit," he said. "It was one gunner." Word spread faster than orders. Across the mess tents and along the supply roads, men began to whisper about the gunner from Kansas who had stopped a Panzer column alone. The story grew, as stories do. Some said he'd destroyed 10 tanks with 5 shells. Others swore he'd used bouncing shots off the frozen ground, ricocheting rounds into weak armor points like some kind of marksman savant. Thompson, when he heard it, only shook his head. The truth didn't need embellishment. Meanwhile, the official investigation began. Division intelligence combed through the wreckage reports, cross-checked maps, reviewed every page of Thompson's field notebook. They interviewed his loader, his assistant gunner, even attempted to trace the radio logs from that day. But the records were fractured by static and interference. There was no proof that he had received any orders, or that he hadn't. In the absence of evidence, only the results remained. 7 German vehicles confirmed destroyed, 4 more disabled, 0 American casualties, 1 critical supply route, Noville's Northern Road, held, and 1 surrounded division, the 101st Airborne, reconnected to its lifeline. When the findings reached division command, Langston was called back in. He expected reprimand. Instead, the commanding officer closed the report and said, "Don't file this in the official record, not yet, but tell your man, we're watching his work." No medals, no speeches, no headlines. Thompson didn't need them. His name didn't appear in the after-action briefings. His photo never made it into the papers. But quietly, orders began to shift. Training manuals for tank destroyer crews were updated to include sequential firing patterns, the very strategy he had improvised that day. Thompson was later assigned to teach new gunners how to disable armored columns through timing and logic rather than brute force. No one ever said the word hero, and Thompson never asked them to. That night, in the stillness of the Belgian forest, the last fires from the wreckage flickered low and finally died. A light snow began to fall again, thin as dust, settling over the burned steel and frozen ground. The air smelled faintly of oil and pine. From somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, a sound long and mournful, fading into the cold. And in that silence, broken only by the whisper of snow, the legend of the ghost battery was born. They asked him to put it on paper, to draw out his thoughts, his decisions, the strange and methodical sequence that had unfolded in those frozen woods near Noville. At first, Ray Thompson thought it was just procedure, another report to be filed away and forgotten. But weeks later, he learned his diagrams had been sent all the way to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to the U.S. Army Artillery School. That's when it hit him. They weren't simply forgiving what he had done. They were studying it, turning it into something to be taught, something to be learned. One evening, as the sun fell low and bled across the horizon in streaks of burnt gold, Captain Langston approached him. Thompson was cleaning the breech of a recoilless rifle, oiling the barrel in slow, practiced motions. The air smelled of metal and solvent. "You know," Langston began quietly, "I was ready to report you for insubordination." Thompson looked up but said nothing. The captain shrugged. "But then I read that line in your notebook, the one about controlled collapse. What did you mean by that?" Thompson set the rifle aside and wiped his hands on a rag. "When you pull one stone from a wall," he said softly, "the rest will fall, if you know where to pull." Langston studied him for a moment, then smiled, just barely. "Well," he said, "next time you decide to knock down a wall, give me a little warning first." Thompson didn't smile back. He just nodded, because to him, it wasn't victory. It wasn't even rebellion. It was geometry, logic, necessity. And deep down, he knew. It could have gone the other way. He had made peace with that long ago. War doesn't always punish disobedience. Sometimes it learns from it. What followed would quietly reshape doctrine. Ray Thompson never asked to be remembered. He didn't keep journals or pose for photographs. After the war, he went home to Kansas, where the wind moved endlessly across the plains like the tide of an invisible ocean. He married a girl named Helen from the next town over, opened a small repair shop near Dodge City, fixed tractors, welded broken harvesters, built grain silos with his bare hands. In the evenings, he'd teach his son geometry by scratching triangles into the dust with a stick. Angles, distances, leverage, the same language that had once saved lives. He never called himself a hero, but others did. Years after the Battle of the Bulge, the Army quietly began to teach something new, something they called asymmetrical engagement sequencing. A long academic name for a deceptively simple idea. Don't aim for the front, aim for the collapse. The first case study they used was labeled only Engagement near Noville, Belgium, December 1944. No names were attached. The students at Fort Sill and later at Fort Benning studied it in grainy black and white. A forest road, wreckage patterns, vehicle placements, firing arcs traced in red pencil. It was unclassified, but buried deep in manuals few officers ever read. Still, those who did understood why it mattered. It wasn't about firepower. It was about thought, how one man's logic under pressure could alter the shape of battle. It showed that a single gunner, if he understood space, timing, and fear, could stop an entire armored column, not with strength, but with geometry. Years later, One colonel, who had studied that Noville engagement as a young lieutenant, summarized it in a lecture. "He didn't break orders," the man said, tapping the board with his pen. "He operated beyond them." It was the paradox of command. A soldier who disobeyed the chain of command became the example of flexible thinking the Army would later teach. His unofficial firing pattern, refined and redrawn by instructors, would later influence Cold War training doctrine, particularly for the crews preparing to face Soviet armored divisions in Eastern Europe. The principle was simple, revolutionary, and born from a Kansas wheat field. Create artificial choke points by targeting specific vehicles, and then use the enemy's discipline, their reliance on CMP formation, against them. Collapse the system from within. Decades passed. The war faded into documentaries and dusty textbooks. But one day, a military historian, a quiet man with a fascination for forgotten reports, found something remarkable in a cardboard box marked After Action Logs, 1944-45. It was a thin folder stamped with a faded red line, confidential, declassified. Inside was Captain Langston's original field report, his handwriting still sharp, notes in the margin underlined twice. The historian read it once, then again, his pulse quickening. He decided to find the man behind it. By then, Ray Thompson was in his 80s. He lived in a modest one-story house with his wife, Helen, and a gray cat named Murphy. The walls smelled faintly of motor oil and old books. When the historian knocked on the door, Thompson opened it slowly, hard of hearing, but steady as ever. They sat at the kitchen table, light spilling in through thin curtains, a half-finished crossword between them. When asked about that day in the Ardennes, Ray didn't speak right away. He stared out the window for a long moment. The winter sun caught the edge of his glasses, and his hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of memory. "I remember the trees," he said finally, "and how still it was before the first shot, like the whole world was holding its breath." He didn't talk about victory or glory or even fear, just precision, just necessity. When the historian asked why he hadn't waited for orders, Thompson smiled faintly and said, "Because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late." He paused, eyes distant, then added softly, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them. For a minute. Long enough to do what had to be done." That line never made it into the official history books, but it stayed with the historian and with everyone who ever read that file afterward. Ray Thompson didn't win the war. He didn't capture cities or lead divisions, but he saved a road. He saved a regiment that day, a thread of supply and survival that kept thousands alive through one of the coldest winters in Europe's history. He saved a moment, fragile and fleeting, but enough to matter. And in war, sometimes that's everything. He reminded the Army that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it calculates. Sometimes it looks through a scope and makes a choice no one else can make, not out of defiance, but out of duty. One gunner, one decision, one sequence of fire, and an entire column of steel brought quietly to its knees beneath the frozen trees of the Ardennes. Outside his farmhouse years later, the wind would still whistle through the wheat like distant artillery. The same rhythm, the same breath of the past echoing across Kansas. And in that sound, if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear it. The ghost of the Wolverine still waiting in the woods, patient, watchful, ready to act when orders fall silent.